where Jung was wrong about yoga. Jung spent decades studying yoga, writing about it with genuine admiration, and warning Western practitioners against it in the same breath. His respect for the tradition was real. So was his skepticism. And the skepticism, in at least 4 specific ways, was wrong. What he got right first? He understood yoga as a technology of consciousness, not a fitness system. When he wrote about it, he was writing about the real thing, the systematic transformation of psyche through disciplined attention, breath, posture, and contemplation. He read the texts. He engaged with the tradition seriously enough to run a seminar on Kundalini Yoga in 1932 with Indologist Wilhelm Hauer that remains one of the more remarkable documents in the history of Western psychology. He also identified something real about how yoga gets used in the West. His phrase about yoga on Fifth Avenue being a spiritual fake stings precisely because it is accurate about a specific phenomenon. The use of spiritual practice as a way to avoid the thing spiritual practice is a support to confront. You can build an elaborate daily routine of pranayama and asana and meditation and still never once look at your shadow. Jung spotted this before it became a billion-dollar industry, before it became an industry at all. His reading of Kundalini as a symbolic map of psychological development rather than a literal anatomic claim was also genuinely useful. The chakra system as a topology of consciousness, not a diagram of subtle body. A productive interpretive move that still holds up. Now, for where it falls apart. Mistake 1. The radical difference that wasn't. Jung's central argument rests on a claim about psychology. That Eastern and Western minds are constituted differently in ways that makes Eastern methods dangerous for Western practitioners. He was explicit about this. He will infallibly make a wrong use of yoga, he wrote, because his psychic disposition is quite different from that of the Oriental. Elsewhere, he put it even more directly. Study yoga, he wrote, learn an infinite amount from it, but do not try to apply it. For we Europeans are not so constituted that we apply these methods correctly, just like that. Working with students from across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, what I consistently find is something more specific than Jung's broad claim. The differences are primarily cultural and aesthetical. They appear in the forms through which unconscious content gets expressed, in how people relate to sacred imagery, in the symbolic vocabulary that feels native versus foreign, in whether a deity reads as alive or decorative. A particular image comes to mind: Chinnamasta, the Hindu goddess who severs her own head and drinks her own blood, is one of the most confronting figures in the tantric tradition. When Western students encounter her for the first time in courses or in personal guidance sessions, the reaction is almost always the same. shock, revulsion, occasionally real distress. But once the symbolic layer is explained, once the image is read rather than just seen, something shifts. The goddess of self transcendence, of ego, sacrificed to liberate the energy it was holding. The blood feeding her own attendants, a precise description of a psychological movement that every serious practitioner eventually encounters. The image works. The psyche that receives it is not different from the one for which it was made. Once you learn to work through the symbolic layer rather than stopping at it, the underlying structure is the same. The psyche beneath the cultural surface does not appear to differ in any fundamental way. The axial age, roughly 800 to 200 BCE, produced independent articulations of remarkably similar insights in Greece, India, China, and Persia at the same time. That parallel emergence reflects a shared substrate, not a coincidence of geography. Jung's insistence on radical difference was in part a theoretical necessity. If the psyches are fundamentally similar, the methods transfer and his entire cautionary framework becomes much harder to sustain, which is perhaps why he never examined that assumption too closely. Mistake 2. Eurocentrism dressed as psychology. His position was that Westerners are constitutionally unsuited for practices developed in the East, that we lack the psychic foundation, the cultural preparation, and the instinctual relationship to nature that would make these methods safe. Indians, by contrast, are apparently fine. This framing flatters neither side. It essentializes both. Jung's knowledge of Indian sources was genuine but selective. He engaged with certain texts and certain interpretations while remaining largely outside the living transmission of the traditions he was analyzing. This matters because tradition is not identical to text. What gets lost in reading without practice is what actually determines whether a method is dangerous or not. Context, relationship, gradual approach, the presence of someone who actually knows the terrain. We are also in a different situation than Jung was. Access to primary texts, to serious scholarship, to practitioners with genuine lineage transmission has changed dramatically. There is now a substantial body of research on the effects of meditation, breathwork, and energy practices across different cultural populations. The findings consistently point toward universality, not cultural specificity. The condition for safe and genuine practice is not cultural origin. It is depth of engagement. A practitioner willing to move past the surface layer of postural yoga as it appears in Western fitness studios will encounter the same psychological territory the tradition has always described. And here is the asymmetry that is hard to explain away. Jung developed active imagination as the Western equivalent of Eastern meditation and considered it safe for Western practitioners. But he was also explicit that the method is not without its dangers and should, if possible, not be employed except under expert supervision. Without proper guidance, he warned, archetypal contents can overpower the conscious mind and take possession of the personality. His own method required transmission, relationship, and trained guide. He simply didn't apply the same reasoning to yoga. The traditions themselves agreed. The Katha Upanishad states plainly, arise, awake, and seek the teacher. Classical tantric texts are even more specific, insisting that genuine mastery can only be achieved through the instructions of a guru at whose feet the student must take refuge. The transmission is not optional, it is the method. Jung identified the right criterion, he just applied it selectively. Mistake 3. Samadhi as regression. He understood samadhi as a kind of dissolution, a falling back into unconsciousness, a regression to a pre-egoic state. He was direct. The yogis attain perfection in samadhi, a state of ecstasy, which so far as we know is equivalent to a state of unconsciousness. To the Western mind, he added, samadhi is nothing but a meaningless dream state. The tradition disagree, categorically. What remains in deep meditative states is not the absence of awareness, but its purification. When ordinary mental modifications dissolve, what remains is pure consciousness, the witness, what Sanskrit calls sakshi. The Annapurnamba Upanishad defines samadhi as a state in which consciousness is fully illuminate. Nirvikalpa samadhi is the precise opposite of sleep. In sleep, the mind is absorbed in darkness. In nirvikalpa samadhi, the illusion of ego dissolves, but the state itself is permeated by pure light of consciousness. Jung never experienced this. That is not a criticism, but it meant he was theorizing from the outside, using categories that were not adequate to the phenomenon. The man who insisted on direct experience over inherited dogma made his most significant error in a domain where he had no direct experience. Mistake 4. The target has already moved. By the time Jung issued his warnings, yoga was already being transformed for Western consumption. He acknowledged this himself. Nothing that Westerners tend to practice it in an extroverted fashion, oblivious of the interning of the mind, which is the essence of such teachings. The holistic nature of the tradition, he observed, gets lost entirely. Not a trace is to be found of the unity and wholeness of nature, which is characteristic of yoga. He was describing something real. The yoga arriving in European and American cities was not the Yoga Sutras in their full form. It was a hybrid system already stripped of its metaphysical presuppositions, integrated with Victorian physical culture, reframed around health and vitality. Most Western practitioners were not attempting ego dissolution, they were stretching their hamstrings and learning to breathe. Jung was warning against something that was never the project. It is also worth saying that authentic transmission remains genuinely rare. What gets passed through actual tantric lineages The technical instructions, the philosophical grounding, initiation into specific practices is still not widely accessible in the West. The surface has become easier to reach, the depth has not. Jung's critique pointed in the wrong direction. The real problem was never that Westerners were attempting too much. It was that most were getting too little. What remains? The question Jung was circling but couldn't quite answer is still life. What does it mean to practice a tradition that didn't grow from your soil? Not whether it is possible, but what it actually requires. He gave us a partial answer. Transmission matters, context matters, the presence of someone who knows the terrain matters. He just applied these insights inconsistently, protecting his own method while dismissing the one that came from elsewhere. There is a recognizably human error. It doesn't diminish what he built. It just means we don't have to repel it. A reflection to try. Find an image from a tradition that is not yours. It doesn't have to be extreme like Chinnamasta. Any deity, symbol, or ritual object that produces an instinctive reaction in you, whether discomfort, attraction, or confusion will work. Sit with the image for a few minutes without trying to understand it intellectually. Notice where in the body the reaction lives. Then ask one question: what quality or force does this image represent? What it means historically? What it points to as a psychological reality? If the image begins to feel less foreign and more like a precise description of something you already know, you have just crossed the boundary Jung believed was uncrossable.